And this is coffee, by the way, before we start recording.
This may or may not be coffee.
And record. Oh, y'all are too funny. Okay. So hello and welcome everybody to today's live book talk about Lawrence Lanahan's The Lines Between Us, Two Families and a Quest to Cross Baltimore's Racial Divide. My name is Mindy Levin and I am the founder and director of SOURCE, the Community Engagement and Service Learning Center for the Johns Hopkins University Schools of Public Health, Nursing, and Medicine. SOURCE was founded in 2005, and this year we are recognizing 15 years of service to Johns Hopkins and Baltimore. Our work here at SOURCE focuses on engaging the Hopkins health professional schools and Baltimore communities in mutually beneficial partnerships that promote health and social justice. Through all of our different programs and activities, we actively engage in continual learning and knowledge building around social justice. This certainly includes exploring and understanding the root causes of social issues and the historical context of systems of oppression. And The Lines Between Us is a critical tool for such learning and is centered here in Baltimore. So a few acknowledgments today as we discuss Baltimore. We respectfully acknowledge and give thanks to the Piscataway tribe, the indigenous people who are traditional owners of the lands of the Chesapeake Bay region. We acknowledge all indigenous peoples, the traditional owners of the lands and waters of the United States of America. We acknowledge the impact of racist, systemic oppression, including the practice of redlining on the lives of Black and Brown folks in Baltimore. We also acknowledge the digital divide. We know that many folks do not have access to technology to be able to join us today, and we fully intend to offer an in-person discussion when we are able to safely be together again. And now for introductions to today's special guests. Lawrence Lanahan is an award-winning journalist and author whose work has appeared on NPR's Morning Edition, Al Jazeera America, and many other outlets. He hosted an award-winning 50-episode series for Baltimore's public radio station, WYPR, also called The Lines Between Us. Lawrence has reported on the dynamics of segregation and racial inequality for more than a decade. Stephen Ragsdale will serve as today's moderator. He is a longtime friend of SOURCE and mine, a local historian, and a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant with a brand new faculty appointment in the School of Public Health. We also will be welcoming Elder C.W. Harris. He is the founder and pastor emeritus of Newborn Community of Faith and the founder of Intersection of Change, one of our SOURCE partnering community-based organizations in West Baltimore. And Elder Harris is also featured in Lawrence's book. All of us actually grew up in the Baltimore region, and you'll see that we have much to say. And as we explore the historical context of systems of oppression, we'll also hope to make clear to you why we thought that this conversation was of critical importance in today's context of COVID-19. We're going to start first with some opening remarks from Lawrence Lanahan, and then we'll turn it over to some discussion with Stephen and Elder Harris. At that point in time, we'll go to the chat and take some questions from you all, our audience. But I do want to say thank you so much for being with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lawrence for some opening remarks. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks for, it's a real honor to be here with all of you. I can only see Mindy and Stephen and hopefully Elder Harris in just a moment. But I believe the rest of you are here. I can't see you, but I believe it. And I thank you so much for coming. So I just have a few remarks, a few minutes here to get going. I don't know if you can see the book right back there. So if you've been paying attention, to this region, you've probably noticed that any social variable that you care to measure in Baltimore, right down to life expectancy, reveals deep racial inequality. Decades of housing segregation and racism have created these divides. My book, The Lines Between Us, tries to explain why, revealing how segregationist attitudes became legitimized and institutionalized in law and policy. The book doesn't just look at the bigotry-soaked days before the civil rights movement. Over time, racial discrimination took on more and more plausible deniability. There are plenty of stories in the book just from the last decade. I look both at the barriers to investment in poor Black communities like West Baltimore's Sandtown Winchester neighborhood, where Elder Harris is right now, as well as the great lengths that white suburban communities go to in order to shut down plans for low-income housing. Those housing units, the low-income housing units, provide a direct path to opportunities like low crime and high performing schools for people who want to move their children out of harm's way. I tell the story of two families in this book. A Black woman who moves her son from West Baltimore to Columbia, Maryland for those very opportunities I mentioned, and a white couple who moved from the white suburb of Bel Air to live in solidarity with the Black poor in Sandtown. The book starts with a major lawsuit filed by the ACLU of Maryland when Baltimore City and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development tried to demolish the city's high-rise public housing. The ACLU wanted to make sure that every part of the region, not just Baltimore City, took their fair share of public housing when it came time to replace the towers. The end of the book includes an epic battle between Baltimore-based Under Armour and a group of activists and organizers. Under Armour had planned a new headquarters on the Baltimore waterfront with retail and thousands of apartments, and they wanted a subsidy from the city to build it. The activists rallied to demand local hiring and affordable housing at Port Covington, lest the new neighborhood become an overwhelmingly white and wealthy outpost on what is already a very disproportionately white peninsula in a majority Black city. When COVID-19 came around, I realized that the processes perpetuating racial inequality that I'd written about the book appeared to move in slow motion in retrospect. I wrote all the way from the Fair Housing Act of 1968 to the 2015 death of Freddie Gray and beyond. That's 5 decades, and looking back now, it feels like slow motion. This outbreak has lasted all of 2 or 3 months here, and you can already see how the lines between us are shaping the spread and impact of coronavirus. None of this is news, in the traditional sense of news. You're watching people drop dead disproportionately, and it was entirely predictable. The factors creating differential exposure and susceptibility to coronavirus for African Americans, as well as differential access to healthcare, were documented after the H1N1 or swine flu pandemic. And the social determinants of health have been a priority at the World Health Organization. You may have heard of that in the news recently. They've been after the social determinants of health for years. A CDC report claimed that social determinants have a greater effect on health than genes, medical care, and health behavior combined. Thinking about coronavirus in the context of my book, I realized that this outbreak is just the latest link in a century-long chain of structural racism and white supremacy that is just bringing a long history of exclusion full circle. I went back to my book recently and investigated to my book materials and investigated the role of public health in creating Baltimore's pioneering municipal segregation ordinance. It was the first one in the nation, passed in 1910. It said Black people couldn't move to white blocks and vice versa. Some of the language supporting that measure was nakedly about white fears of crime and declining property values, but some segregationists dressed up their arguments in the language of the era's progressive social reform. It was about containing the spread of tuberculosis, which thrived in the overcrowded alley streets where many Black city residents lived. They lived there because of high demand for housing and low supply. Some argued for segregation to keep white communities safe from TB. Others put themselves forth as a little more benevolent. They said, let's keep segregation, but let's expand the boundaries of Black Baltimore. We'll knock down the slums, maybe turn them into parks. That'll be good for the health of Black Baltimoreans too. Given the history of public health in inscribing these lines between us, this is a 100-year quarantine. White people congregate the way they do for a reason, often because they know that wealth follows whiteness. They'll move around just to keep their communities and public schools, white enough to keep the wealth flowing. And it's not just wealth that follows whiteness, health follows whiteness too. I said this outbreak is the most recent link in a century-long chain of structural racism and white supremacy. If we want to break that chain and if we want to save lives right now, we have to learn this history and act on it. Governor Hogan recently lamented the racial disparities showing up in COVID-19 data. He should have seen it coming. He should have had a plan to do something about it before the data came out. We all need to do something about it, not just to create racial equity in the next pandemic, but because we are about to embark on a major restructuring of American society, and we need to do it in a way that dismantles racial inequality in all aspects of life.
Wow. Lawrence, thank you for that presentation.
Thank you.
I have a great appreciation for your 100-year quarantine, but as a historian, I would even mark it a little further back than that. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
if you take the marker, let's just so we can just kind of create some context here. If you take the marker of 1910, which is still around, I mean, this is around the time that Morgan College is looking to move. They're facing the threat of a lawsuit. Um, 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 there's massive, massive, massive amounts of investment coming into Baltimore as a result of a fire that had burned down like all of downtown, like 6 years ago before then. And there's a housing report that you and I talked about, that Janet Camp housing report that comes out in 1907, that literally begins to inculcate that kind of need to quarantine Black citizens as a result of not only their bad health, but their inability to see how bad they are for the rest of society. And so because they have no ability to kind of take care of themselves, right? They have a lighthearted, gregarious nature when it comes to their own health care. We, who are white folks belonging to the system, have to protect ourselves, from that encroachment. And you hear language written throughout. I mean, and again, prior to 1910, the threat of violence, if there's any kind of social or political movement around leveling Black humanity upwards, right, in the public health space or in public space at all, and it's even written into the legislation. We talked about, you and I have talked about the Morgan case where the 3 bills were introduced in Annapolis in 1916 and 1917. And it was, I think the bills were titled the bills to protect conflict between the races, or and I'm paraphrasing, but it was always kind of like this sense of violence. Like if you move beyond what was racially the status quo and leveled the playing field for Black people at all. And so I began to wonder, where did this threat of violence, because at that point in time, Tulsa, Oklahoma hadn't happened yet. Rosewood hadn't happened yet. That's 20 and 20, I think 21 and 23. So that predates that. And so I had to go back and look well, what was there violence outside of what we know about lynching, was there mob violence? And I identified the 85 years prior to 1910, 50 different riots that occurred where it was white mob violence, mostly around Black encroachment into what they perceived to be white spaces all the way back to 1835.
Yeah.
So by the time you're talking about this threat, the threat of violence when it comes to kind of leveling the social ecology, by 1910, that's a real threat.
It's a very real thing. And you were doing, by counting that, you're doing the same thing that Ida B. Wells was doing when she was reporting on lynching. She was counting so that
That's
people would
exactly right.
know the enormity of it. And it's not over. It's not over because what I've been talking about in my book talks recently is that if you manage to succeed in peeling back some of these structures that constitute structural racism, exclusionary housing policies and like that, you pull away a bit of that structural racism and you will see white supremacy beneath. Baltimore County their council just voted 4-3 to ban discrimination on source of income, like ban discrimination on whether you have a Section 8 voucher or not. They had voted against it 6-1 3 years earlier. So they really needed a couple council people to flip. And the 2 council people that flipped were under 24/7 police protection during that whole process leading up to that vote because of the shocking things they were getting in their voicemails and emails. When Howard County came forth with a plan to put economic equity into their school redistricting, like moving a lot of students around, a student from the whitest, richest school in Columbia posted a death threat against the superintendent.
Right.
He said he was joking, but where did he think his joke would land?
Right.
There. So we talk in turn. I mean, when I got going on this book, part of it was like, well, people know what white supremacy is and bigotry, but I want to talk about these sort of like facially neutral, policies that perpetuate segregation, even when you can't divine any discriminatory intent,
Well,
and then like 2 years later, the election happens and white supremacists came out of the woodwork.
Well, I like the word and the way that you framed this is you use the language the mass progressive, right? And when you look at the history of Maryland as a border state, I mean, this is literally the quintessential. It behaves as these places have a culture, a personality, if you will, and that personality is evident. But I want you to talk about like that that a little bit more. How Baum talks about like the failure of liberalism to equalize education, right? In Baltimore, like literally, like liberalism kind of or progressive politics kind of comes to the water's edge when it comes to solving these problems. And this is not new. This is something that has literally been around since like these are concepts that have been around since the Emancipation Proclamation. This kind of progressive pushback. Oh, we're helping. So can you talk about that a little bit and how, in the wake of how that might play out in this current environment?
Sure. I mean, the liberalism that Howell talks about in that book is the liberalism of let things move freely, let people, choose as they want to choose. And excuse me, Baltimore was one of the first places to implement Brown versus Board. They did it. Walter Sondheim brought it to a vote, 3 weeks after the Supreme Court decision. But the way they implemented it and the way that the housing authority at the same time implemented desegregation in public housing was free choice.
Right.
Anybody can, it's like this colorblind, all lives matter kind of approach to it of like, well, people's best sides will shine forth as we let them, choose to do what they wanted. And so when you think about social constraints, well, people, the middle class Black people are the families who chose to integrate, right? Like Kiefer Mitchell's dad integrated Gwynns Falls Junior High. I interviewed him about that experience. They could transport themselves far enough to go to these schools that had the resources, and the poorer Black families didn't have a way to transport themselves and ended up in the what had been the colored schools that didn't have the resources. And when
Right.
middle class Black families got to the white schools, the white families split. And so it's not a dynamic that has really died away. And by the way, I interviewed Howell Baum and Ray Wimbush at Morgan about this, and NAACP was okay with this.
Right.
And
That's
we
exactly right.
were a border state, and what Diane Bell McCoy called a polite way of dealing with race in this region. And so the ostensibly liberal people were like, let's just let everybody do what they want. Yes, we're desegregating. Let's let everybody do what they want. But what's really behind some of that is this idea of local control, right? and we don't get the control over the schools we want, we go somewhere else where we can. Like in St. Louis, part of what led up to Ferguson was that when white flight, when white people left St. Louis, the city, they would like move a little ways out into the county and incorporate a
Mm-hmm.
town. And
Mm-hmm.
when that town was not wide enough for them anymore, they would move again and incorporate another town. Eventually, you have 90 municipalities in that county, all racing to the bottom of the barrel, competing for economic development. And so, what do they do for revenue? They get people for jaywalking. It's fines
Right.
and fees. And so, I mean, this idea of local control, this idea of fleeing when the liberalism doesn't create the community you want, that never stops. And a lot of what I write about in the book, just in the past 10 years, is about a big fight in the Maryland legislature over local control of whether low-income housing gets built in the suburbs. Maryland had a provision where if a developer wanted to build low-income housing out in a place with, you know, more money, better performing schools, lower crime, they had to get a financial contribution and a sign off from the jurisdiction, the local government where they wanted to build. And the city was always like, brand new apartments in places where there are lots of poor people and the rent is affordable. Yes, please, we'll take the investment. Out in the suburbs, they're like, no way. And that has direct impacts on health because when they did experiments in moving public housing residents from the city to the county in the 90s, they didn't get the numbers they wanted on wealth and economics, on employment, but they did get the numbers on whether people were healthier and felt safer. And so you're literally building walls up until about 2014 when this provision gets repealed in Maryland, preventing people from accessing health and wellness. So these lines, there's already a great book that I bet a bunch of you have read called Not in My Neighborhood by Antero Piazza.
Yeah.
The subtitle of that book is How Bigotry Shaped a Great American City. And in some ways, I just wanted to write a sequel because his book kind of tails off around the 70s. But my book starts in the late
Around the
60s, early
70s.
70s, and you don't see the explicit bigotry, but you see the same results.
Well, I've always
Really
kind of
sailing COVID.
I've always kind of treated, Mr. Penthel is a dear friend, and I've always kind of treated your book kind of like the next chapter.
It's a sequel. It's totally a sequel.
It's the next iteration. I would be remiss though, and I asked Antero similar questions. I work with a lot of social justice folks who are interested in the environment, and one of the after all, our bodies are comprised mostly of like what comes out of nature, water, right? And water water access and air can have a devastating consequence to not only your life quality, but but how you receive healthcare and health, if you will. One of the things that I wanted you to noodle on is, the I want you to kind of talk about that the question of this environmental I don't want to call it entrapment, but they're kind of like locked into these environmental devastating circumstances.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
that steal IQ points, that still have young children like dying from asthma, when it's 100% controllable. I want you to kind of talk about that a little bit in your discovery, and particularly kind of like beyond the book. I want you to talk about it like in light of like your podcast and some of your discovery.
Sure. Well, if we
podcast.
can, let's start like right now. This is
Right.
COVID is a respiratory illness.
Right.
Right. So you've got so many aggravating factors creating racial disparities. I mean, what sectors of work people in those neighborhoods are working in, how long they got to be on the bus to get there, how many grandkids are living with their grandparents. One of these factors is that you already have these environmental hazards concentrated in poor areas with, large Black and Hispanic populations. You already have the asthma there. You already have like the health factors within these people, never mind the allostatic load of being Black in this country and in this city, but the respiratory problems that are already going on because of environmental hazards, setting the stage for deeper illnesses from this thing. Then you go back to, do you know why Cherry Hill Homes was built where it was?
Yep.
They That was
Yeah,
like
but share the
an
story. Share the,
yeah, that was an inhospitable peninsula
that's exactly
um,
right.
with environmental hazards, and so we built all this permanent housing for war workers during World War II, for white war workers, right? And there was some temporary housing for black war workers,
Hmm.
but it took forever to get any permanent housing built for black war workers. When they finally got it done, they got it done in Cherry Hill because it was on that peninsula with the environmental hazards. And guess when it opened? December 1945. Hitler's corpse was pretty cool by that point. We were out of Japan. I mean, there wasn't even a war anymore
Right.
by the time they got black war housing built, and they did it in Cherry Hill because you could not get land in Baltimore for black housing because of the
Since
threat of
19,
violence. White
right.
neighborhoods would freak out. They were going to build Gilmore homes down um, along what's now Washington Boulevard, Route 1, past Pigtown. But then people were like, no, the white children will be walking to school, white people will be walking to work. We can't do it there. So it ended up in Sandtown. And when in my book, I have pictures of the houses they knocked down to build more homes in Sandtown. They said they were knocking down slums. There's a lot of perfectly nice houses and middle-class families that got displaced. To do that, the whole idea of slum clearance was to give black people healthier places to live. They were knocking down like decent townhouses. So yeah, and even you even see the environment brought in as an excuse to block low-income housing. Like Anne Arundel County had a hearing because they were trying to block some low-income housing apartments that were going to be built in Severna Park, and the head of the Riverkeeper Association came and testified, and he's like, well, the river's already making our dogs sick, and we're going to have all these new people living here, and it's going to be bad for the river, right? But by the end of his remarks, the last thing he says is, gentlemen, we live here because we like the single-family suburban style of living, and we intend to keep it that way. Yeah, so I mean, the environment, it plays into health, and it also just plays into
The
any
politics.
plausible deniability for keeping communities homogenous.
Uh, um, I want to talk a little bit more about your policy. Like one of the things that I talk about a lot is Baltimore's personality, what I call Baltimore socioecology, which is something that I believe that we've been forming and fomenting for like literally the last 200 years. You see kind of like these social behaviors that never kind of deviate from like what I call like the normal Baltimore standard. One of the things that I was struck by when we talked about it through the lens of progressive politics, but was like how Baltimore in particular responded to, and the surrounding counties responded to Thompson v. HUD. First off, tell us what Thompson v. HUD was.
Yeah, let me do the short version of that. So
Right.
Baltimore City and HUD wanted to knock down, Baltimore had 4 high-rise housing projects. By the 90s, everybody wanted to knock these down. Clinton's administration was offering Hope 6, a program to fund the reconstruction of these communities as mixed income, low-rise public housing. Now, there was a law at the time that said if every unit of public housing that was demolished or decommissioned had to be replaced. And so the city wants to knock these down, and the ACLU of Maryland and some public housing tenants said, hey, hold up. You segregated this public housing by law when you built it. You knocked down black neighborhoods and concentrated public housing in poor black neighborhoods when you built it. You have a chance here to right a historic wrong, and we're filing a motion for injunction to keep you from knocking these things down. And we're suing you for all the discrimination that made it this way in the first place, hoping that the entire region, the counties, would take a fair share of public housing. And after about 18 months, the city and HUD reached a partial consent decree just over part of the suit, and they said, all right, we're going to do 1,300 special Section 8 vouchers. Section 8 is when you rent in the private market, and you pay 30% of your income towards your rent. Government pays the rest. And so these special vouchers could only be used in areas that were no more than 25% minority population, no higher than 10% poverty rate. It was intended to give people a fair choice of places to live. 1,300 of these things. It went to trial. It took until 2012 to get a final settlement when they did 2,600 more of these vouchers. But it's shifted the landscape more than other regions in terms of where poor and especially Black poor families choose to live with vouchers. You see a lot more choosing high opportunity areas in this region than you do just about anywhere else in the country, besides Las Vegas, which I haven't figured out why. But Las Vegas is also an outlier on some of this stuff.
I found that I found that compelling and remarkable. But one of the things that I find was like when I read it, I didn't find it like I saw some surprise, like in how the surrounding counties responded to Thompson v. HUD, right? Not so
You were
much
surprised?
like no, I wasn't surprised. That's what I was saying. Like,
okay.
You see kind of like this, but this noticeable shock that that places like Howard County, like Anne Arundel County, Baltimore County, are don't want to be a part of the settlement, are pushing themselves away from the table, and there seems to be this. They seem to be mystified that the counties are behaving in this way and don't want to, and when these were, I think, the original, these people who live in these counties they're descendants of Baltimore. This is white ethnic, Baltimore now living in those counties who rejected. This is what they came from, and it wasn't only white folks. I mean, I talk about the fact that, there was Black wealth flight first, and then Black middle class, and then there's Black middle class flight, right? All in the through the lens of achieving economic power, elevation, while economic conditions for one racial group maintains stagnation. So you can move from Baltimore City to Howard County, you increase your opportunity to grow your wealth, but like nominal wealth for the Black community still sits at 10% versus white America's 90%. You understand what I mean? So I think the systematic influence of race and how folks kind of respond to it as a factor, right? Or not instead of the actual condition that we're that we're living in. So we talk about racism, right? We talk about like racial factors in and around this region without actually talking about what causes those racial, factors. What was your experience with that as you were kind of like doing your discovery? How were people willing to engage the racial discussion? I mean, what did that look like from a variety of communities, like community, public community, the lawyers? Like, how did folks kind of engage you as a journalist?
Pretty frankly, honestly, part of it because Thompson v. HUD forced the discussion onto the table. That was a class action suit.
Right.
Black public housing residents. The remedy was race specific. Like, you can only use these vouchers in 75% white communities. Well, why? So you had to talk about this. You also discover that not all counties are kind of handling this the same way. Some are more inclusive than others, right? Like Baltimore County. Baltimore County was 96% white in 1970. and the population had just more than doubled. Like the white population in Baltimore County between 1950 and 1970 more than doubled, like 300,000 new white people. Between 1950 and 1960, the black population managed to drop by 1,000.
Wow.
How does that happen? They gained another
Wow.
2,500 black people by 1970, but that's a drop in the bucket, right? And that is because of a big history of exclusionary housing up there and zoning and all kinds of stuff, and the lack of public housing. I mean, Baltimore City public housing for the longest time, like you didn't matter where you were applying from. You could go to Baltimore City public housing if you lived in Baltimore County or Anne Arundel County. Bob Embry, when he was housing commissioner in 1971, called it a one-way street for the poor from the county to the city. The judge, when he decided Thompson v. HUD, said you cannot use Baltimore City as an island reservation for the region's poor. I mean, this is the dynamic. Now, down in Howard County in the mid 1960s, you had Jim Rouse buying up all this farmland.
Right.
Nobody knew
Separate
who was
tracks.
buying it, and finally people catch on to what he's doing, and they say, "Is your housing going to be racially open?" This is before the Fair Housing Act. And he said, "Yeah. Yeah, and this is going to be a brand new neighborhood, so nobody knows who's moving in next door, so people aren't going to be afraid." And so he came in there with a very inclusionary vision for Columbia, which decades later is why you often see when black families leave Baltimore City, like
They go
Howard
to
County.
Columbia.
Yeah, Howard County is one of the first places they look.
Right.
And not that the black population hasn't grown in Baltimore County, but that's also been kind of segregated in the way that it developed. Up Liberty Road, up Reisterstown Road. So you've got just in Anne Arundel County, really came around last summer. They passed their first fair housing law. They banned source of income discrimination. So you see great variation in the counties, but will people's willingness to talk about this? I mean, I'm from Harford County. I would be less comfortable going back to Harford County and trying to have this discussion. I've had very little response to the book up there. So different places are have different levels of politeness and candor in talking about this stuff. But I think that Freddie Gray really cracked us open, and it's a little harder to pretend, ever since that happened, because it was, I mean, the Kerner Commission wrote about it when they wrote about the riots across America. They wrote about that in 67 and 68 before, the Kerner Commission report came out 5 weeks before Dr. King was assassinated. I mean, it's no secret why these conditions are the way they are. But we have just had an event here where Antro's book and a lot of other stuff and an emboldened Black activist community have kind of raised the baseline of conversation around this stuff in the last 5 years in the region, where even to the point where it emboldens me as a white person who's not always totally comfortable talking about this stuff. I don't really break a sweat getting into this, with you or anybody else right now. It is just so urgent and so deeply rooted here.
Yeah, I was struck by, like you noted, Howard County, right? And I, full disclosure, I'm a resident of Howard County and have fascinated by the development of Howard County. I'm sorry, as Columbia specifically as a planned city, and the fact that Jim Rouse intentionally, he worked in Baltimore, who'd literally kind of grown up in the era of de jure and de facto housing segregation, was like, you know what, this model is flawed. This model is not going to work, and ultimately, this model leads you to economic failure. And so, like the Columbia example, I mean, he's trying to show, that if you kind of exclude kind of racial factors, that this kind, that this society kind of works out better.
Yeah,
for all that it raises all boats. Now, one of the things that I was struck by in your book is, had the woman who moved from Penn North moved, closer to the time when, when he's doing that, when Howard County owns the shopping centers, right? And Howard County can kind of, can dictate, or Columbia can kind of dictate what, how they kind of manufacture and manipulate society.
Yeah, I got you.
So that it works, that it works out for everybody. The level of acceptability of those kind of politics, even in Howard County, have morphed, since Jim Rouse has, had this original vision.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, Columbia is not perfect, and the interesting connection.
Michael.
Oh, hey, Elder Harris.
Is that Elder Harris?
I just can't get my face up. That's all.
Okay, well, we can hear you.
We know how beautiful you are.
Absolutely. Welcome, Elder Harris. We've just been kind of holding it down.
I might back out a little bit here, huh? You want to ask Elder Harris something?
I do.
Got a lot to say.
And so, like, literally, my next question was the Elder Harris question that I was going to just kind of launch over to you. But, like, first off, I want you to have the opportunity to say good morning, Elder Harris, and to tell the audience who you are and why you're here and some of the things that why are you important to this conversation. And with that,
I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone, and how grateful I am to be a part of this session. Thank you. Everyone is seeing my face now.
It looks a lot better than this one, so here.
So I'm an indigenous leader in the community of Sandtown, Winchester. I've been there all my life. I'm 70 years old. And my work is in the trenches, supporting those who are downtrodden. And it is within the 3 goals of CCDA that I'm a part of this operation. That's relocation, redistribution, and reconciliation.
CCDA.
CCDA is Christian Community Development Association.
Okay.
There's a civil rights leader who started this years ago. His name is John Perkins, Mendenhall, Mississippi. And he started this organization, which I'm a proud member of. And so I support, that's John Perkins. I support the efforts of my community members, all of us working together to develop holistically what's ailing us. The poverty, the lack of support for education, housing, health, mental health. And I'm in the center of all of that in that 72 square block area.
How many people lived in that? Elder Harris, you explained something to me yesterday that, and I had seen the numbers before, but I hadn't really contextualized them. At the height of Sandtown, how many people lived in Sandtown, and how many people lived in Sandtown at the height of its growth? Yeah. And how many people lived in that 72 block radius now?
Yeah, well, as you know, I was born in a segregated Baltimore, and in 1950, and there were 40,000 people in the 72 square block area, and now there's about 11,000 in the community.
Yeah, I'd say the astonishing number, and Lawrence and I have agreed on this, was that at a time, I think around 1910, 1915, Baltimore had a population that was maybe 10, 12% of the overall population, but only lived on 2% of the land space. And they were all neighborhoods that had were kind of like deemed, if you will, their neighborhoods. And Sandtown was, Sandtown was one of them. I think Sandtown actually originates down near Camden Yards. And they moved the entire population to the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue because they need the land.
That was intentional.
That was intentional, you know. So, like, again, when land is necessary, when resources necessary, you know, Black life, Black property, or Black institutions are, you know,
We're the
not,
caboose.
they're not really important.
Of all the decisions, we're at the tail end of everything. The famous saying, when my white brothers and sisters catch a cold, we get pneumonia. So it's like that, and it's been like that for years, ever since I've known it.
So I see you as a correspondent on the ground. You are literally on the ground. Lawrence has come in, you know, and given us some excellent work, but the day-to-day understanding of like what's happening in these communities literally kind of like begins and, you know, starts and stops with people like you. Now, the reason that I say that is we're talking about the age of COVID-19 right now, right? And you are the elder of a church, and the Black church historically has been the center place of not only economics, but health economics. Like literally, this is where we've learned to kind of, you know, the Black church is where we've learned to, like, as a community, learn to stay alive, if you will. Now, and which means that in healthcare, they were literally the canary in the coal mine. When Blacks and poor white folks didn't have anything, churches took care of them. Now we've kind of evolved the system where now we still rely on them heavily, you know, for Black healthcare and for folks of low economic status. In the age of COVID-19, what has COVID-19 done to, like, given, like, now that you're down to 11,000 people that you're caring for in your community, what has COVID-19 done to your ability to, like, one, keep your community alive and well, and to two, to sustain the kind of efforts that you do, like, you know, the boots on the ground work that you do, you know, just to kind of keep pace with what we like, those adverse statistics that we see every day. You guys are running in place and keeping us moving. How is this COVID-19 impacting your ability right now, you know, as a church community? Because the hospitals rely on you guys. It's, you know, how are you being impacted? I'm gonna sit back now.
For those who cannot travel, we give our community residents the transportation to get to and fro where they may have to go. We still supply them with fresh produce. I think a week ago, I took a group over to one of our fellow faith community organization that's a part of CUTS, Clergy United for the Transformation of Sandtown. So we have that going. We just hired an organizer who runs our farm on, we have an urban farm in Sandtown, Winchester, on Monroe Street. And they are yet producing fresh fruits and vegetables there on that corner. Now, we do not have our classes with our young people at Jubilee Arts, neither our young people who we have that sell products and they themselves are earning more money than their parents, that those operations are not being fulfilled. But our ladies who suffering with the addiction of drugs and alcohol. They are maintaining their residence, and we're keeping close eyes on them. These are what the church that have come together undercuts. These are the things that we are doing to support our community. Yesterday, we had a virtual meeting through Zoom. The organization that runs all of those projects, it's called Intersection of Change. And so far, from the reports that we have been given from the different leaders of the different organizations, we're holding our own, but we're doing it wisely, and we're doing it to protect ourselves and the community.
How are your older citizens doing? I mean, we've seen the headlines. We've seen the headlines that Black and brown people are dying at a much greater clip.
Yes. Now, locally, I have a parishioner who was stricken and had to go to the hospital. She is now recovering, but other than that, spreading out through the whole community, from the ministers that I talked to, I have not heard anything alarming in our community, but all the news have not come out yet. So, but those who I've contacted, everything is favorable. And so when the cloud and the dust clears, we'll probably hear more.
Excellent. So I'm going to turn it back over. We're at a place now where I think we ought to be, I think we agree that we ought to be taking some questions from our audience. Mindy, you want to handle that?
Sure.
And Mindy,
yes,
I don't know if you can wink to your technician. Every time I try to put my face on, it says that he's holding me out.
Ooh, okay. I'll make that note to Owen to see if he can get your face on here.
I just changed that setting, so he should be all set now.
Oh, yay. Thanks, Owen.
He said I'm all right now?
Yep.
There you are.
Elder Harris.
Oh, man.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
The technician did a wonderful job, I must say.
Yes, we appreciate him.
I put a tie on for this.
So we need to
Elder
see
Harris,
that face.
this is the most dressed up I've been in weeks.
I think all of us, right?
I even put on some cologne. I don't know if you.
Smell-o-vision. So folks,
Odorama.
we do have obviously some tech support here that was actually busy helping get Elder Harris set up. So as you know, we were Zoom bombed within our chat. So we sincerely apologize for that grotesque display of whoever. But we are now able to take questions, and you can submit that, I believe, and Owen will correct me, into our question and answer field. And we did have one question that came in a little bit earlier, so I'll pose it, and any of you can feel free to chime in with a response. But the comment first was that when Stephen was giving the history of Black Baltimore from 1910 and talking about the level of violence being quite deplorable, there was a request to have a little bit more of potential reference to the 1918 flu epidemic and how our Black citizens fared then. And potentially also a brief discussion about the hospital, Johns Hopkins Hospital in particular, and treating Black citizens during that 1918 sickness.
So that epidemic was not like so I'm not an authority on this particular subject. Graham Mooney is, and I never want to steal Graham Mooney's light when it comes to this. Graham Mooney is the historian of the Welsh Institute of the History of Medicine. And what I've learned from him is that Baltimore had the highest tuberculosis rate in the country until, despite race. until 1965. Baltimore had a series of of cholera, yellow fever, and typhoid epidemics, all numbering at least 3, throughout the 19th century. One of the things that I find remarkably powerful in that is like citizens, by proximity, you can kind of forecast what's happening. Black people tend to die quicker because of the conditions that they live in. They live in alley houses versus tenements, and their living conditions are a lot worse. And so, when, like I said, when the elder said, when we catch when Black people, when white folks catch a cold, Black people catch pneumonia, that was kind of like literal. And so you see distinctions in how that plays out. But I like to tell folks that that's kind of baked into the cake. If you go back and you look at like how a lot of these metropolitan areas were formed, physicians early on become part of the power base. In particular, in and around this region, one of the first debates that you see in the formation of Washington, D.C. as a capital is Northern representatives not wanting to travel south, right? Because the ether, around slavery, killed northern white men, right? And there's this fear of kind of like of Black proximity. And so what it does is it kind of reshapes like how you fight disease if you think disease is color driven, and so I can't speak specifically on how it impacted in a particular year, like precisely. What I can tell you is in each and every epidemic, there was a disparity in mortality, and the speed of the speed in which the disease impacted the community.
I'm gonna unmute myself. Thanks, Stephen. I recognize that you also mentioned Graham Mooney, and one of the things that I'll put out there for folks is that through Source a number of years ago with Stephen, Graham, and some others, we developed a small series of online modules. And one of those modules is about how history impacts our work. And it talks about the history specifically between Johns Hopkins and Baltimore. So we have some more information there, which relates to the next very quick question that I'll go into the more in-depth one, and ask for a possible reading list to send to attendees after this event, because we have referenced many different works, books, etc. We do share that information very frequently. Stephen actually gives an updated book reading list that we provide, and I could certainly ask our colleagues here for a list, and we have folks' email addresses to be able to send that out. So thanks for that request.
So just a quick comment on that. One of the things that I think that when we have these discussions, I feel like folks leave the room thinking that the issues and the topics that we're talking about are somewhere off hidden in a safe, in a vault someplace, right? Everything that I've learned, like I have a 5-page reading list, right? Of literally books that focus on the socioecology and the social determinants factors in and around Baltimore and how we live racially. Most of that stuff is available at the Enoch Pratt Library. These are not one-off books and are easily accessible. I think the great majority of us who do this work have no idea, like because Baltimore doesn't study this, how often Baltimore has been studied as an entity when it comes to race, race politics, and how we animate our decision making. I mean, everything from golf to hospitals, tennis, sports and entertainment. That information is out there, and it's one of the ways that I understood Lawrence's work better when I understood that Black people lived all over Baltimore City in the 1900s, right? But somehow we created this construct in 1910 where we forced them into like these localities. That's not what Baltimore was. And if you don't have a context to show that Baltimore like literally had like, these ethnically diverse neighborhoods all throughout the 17 and 1800s, then you can't normalize it. You can't really know, you can't have that vision. You can't see that this is the way that we actually live is now more novel.
Yeah.
And those I serve in my community don't have time to study because they're struggling to live.
Right. That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
So like how we get this information, one of the things that I found remarkable is I've been on, since this COVID-19 thing has been on, like every Zoom broadcast and every podcast that I've been on cites the importance of knowing this history. And to date, literally, this is the only one where I've seen, that I've been on or participated in or have seen that actually had a historian, an authentic historian, a disciplined historian actually talking about the subject matter. Usually it's someone who goes out, does some discovery, and understands that the history is an underlying factor, to what it is that we're talking about. And so we have this compartmentalized understanding of what Baltimore looks like. And, by virtue of Antero's work, by virtue of how Baum's work, and we got to start kind of like pulling that scholarship together and like the elder said, in bite-sized chunks so that people know the fight that they're fighting.
Yeah, and I'll say I'm as big a fan of books as anybody. But I mean, books alone, I mean, I can't tell you how much I learned in spending time in Sandtown. And I know that with COVID, interpersonal connection is pretty difficult right now.
Yes.
But, I don't want to reduce things to the interpersonal level of some kumbaya thing where we cross the lines between us and get to understand one another. But that is necessary but not sufficient. That is, to understand how different our experiences are and what needs to change, you need to know people like Elder Harris. You need to spend time in places like Sandtown. I'm glad you mentioned John Perkins. I'm sure you'll bring up Gordon Cosby. And those are some people whose books I'll put in the list. But this whole idea of Christian community development is that if you want to lift up communities like Sandtown, it ain't going to work if you're commuting in and out. These are people who are saying, this is fairly radical, that, if you want to help a neighborhood like Sandtown, you need to have the same things at stake, and you need to actually live there. And so you have some sort of multiracial organizing and community happening in places like Sandtown, where the white people who are coming in are at least self-aware enough to not dominate every conversation and force their bright ideals on everybody. Intersection of Change, No Boundaries Coalition. You've got these coalitions that want to know who are the leaders who are here already. Who are the people who already know what these communities need? That's why I devoted like at least a third of the book to Christian community development and Elder Harris and New Song Community Church and Newborn and Intersection of Change, where it's like you figure out who the leaders are, and I show people failing to recognize who the leaders are and actually inhibiting change in these communities. So I feel like organizing, getting involved in multiracial coalitions, in also in if you're white affinity groups, like Surge showing up for racial justice and Baltimore Racial Justice Action, there are entrees for you. There's infrastructure for you to come soul to soul with communities with where you'll leave only footprints, I guess, where you're not going to necessarily make things worse. So the books are real important, and we'll send you a list. But when we are all, my 5-year-old, we were talking about something we had done, and he was like, was that when we were allowed to be close to one another? Killed me. So when we're allowed to be close to one another again, that we cross these lines and learn directly from the people who are experiencing it.
So your audience, excuse me for butting in this way, but your audience, I'll challenge your audience to come into our community and let me lead you.
That's what, I was gonna say something very similar to that, Elder Harris. I think the walk is like, I think Lawrence said something, hit on something, and I'm sorry for interrupting because I want you to kind of jump back in on this.
I will.
One of the challenges I think is getting white progressives. We talked about like the white progressives to kind of like walk into these, spaces of color and have dialogue, that is empowering, where they're sharing knowledge, where we're sharing understanding. Like for real, that's how the bar gets lowered. This thing that kind of perpetually happens in Baltimore, where we're coming in, where institutions are coming in to save, that doesn't work, right? I mean, they're not, I think, in a lot of ways, prostrating themselves to understand.
Yeah, you got to save the white communities from themselves.
Right, that's exactly right. And so the thing I think that like has to be really intentional is how do we drive this conversation in white spaces to make it like much more productive.
And I already have the both of you all on my list to come in to speak to the community with the wonderful knowledge that you have to excite them to want to read what you have and get the information so that we can then mobilize and join together for the fight of the ending poverty in the community of Sandtown, Winchester. There's only one thing that has happened since the death of Freddie Gray, and that's the building of a building, Western Police Station. The very officers that killed us, they're the ones that got the new building. So, right. And it's like a fenced community, a gated community, and that's where it looks when you travel there. You feel like it's isolated, that it's not welcoming. It's fenced all around, and right in the heart of our community. So.
Okay. So I'm going to get in this last question, and it's going to be very challenging to cover in the final 3 minutes that we have. So brief remarks here to my esteemed colleagues. So a request was, could we please talk a little bit more about the parallels that we might see between how urban development patterns have aggravated the COVID-19 pandemic, and how they might also aggravate the exposure of marginalized communities, the impacts of climate change.
I think Elder Harris can say plenty about how it's aggravating in communities. I'll just say about climate change that climate change, when it really ramps up, is going to come down to land and where the land is. And America has no problem displacing Black people off of land that is deemed important.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Elder Harris. I'll say that the system-based properties, right? The systemic approach that always kind of like undergirds our discussions never seems to change. And the players, the audiences, or the players seem to stay the same. And the way that we mechanize our solutions always kind of leads us to the same place. I mean, and so whether you're talking about housing, I think because we're talking about COVID-19, that's fast-spreading disease, we're talking about something that's going to, that could possibly be disastrous. I think Lawrence described it as, as a slow-moving hurricane, and so like, yeah, but it's the systemic underpinnings of how we decision make around issues that seem to involve complexities of race always kind of take the same trajectory.
Yeah. Elder Harris, what do you have to say about, development patterns aggravating COVID?
It's not the tip of the iceberg that destroyed the Titanic. It is actually what's underneath, what's holding up the problems of our nation. It is systemic, and from top to bottom. The towers in New York that was destroyed by the two airplanes, and it made the nation come in an uproar and come together to fight the evils of those that destroyed all the people that were in the towers. Well, that's been happening for us for years, and our grandparents and our parents were screaming, please help us in this community. Get rid of all the things that's destroying us, and help us do that. We've been crying for support for years. If we have come together as those who have came together during that issue in New York, we'd be a whole lot better off today. So we're fighting now gentrification in our community. We want to be in control of who comes in our community, and that's what we're fighting now. They're tearing down our buildings in our community, but we know what's next to happen. That these people from outside will come in, develop us, and we would never know what our community once looked like, because it'd be all changed to what happened in Georgetown. That was a Black community, and you would never know it if you go there today. So these are the things that are happening. Why we have caught the cold. My white brothers and sisters have caught the cold, and now we're in a state where most of the folks in the urban communities and those who are challenged are in the hospitals now, dying of this virus, and it's because of that, the underpinnings, that large boulder that's under that tip of the iceberg. That's what brought down the Titanic, and it's going to bring down this whole nation. It is how you treat those who are less among you, who are struggling, and the poor. That's all Jesus talked about. And the thing of it is this: right after, this is the week after we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that's all he spoke about, was how you support those who are less fortunate than you are. We're not doing that. We're not doing that enough, and we're fighting one another, and it's not going to last. If you want to know what destruction is, it will be if you continue to do that.
Yeah.
So
the epigraph to my book is a quote from a Stevie Wonder song. It says, "I don't even have to do nothing to you." The next line is, "You'll cause your own country to fall."
that's right.
Listen to that song, Big Brother. It's everything
That's
Elder
right.
Harris is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to have to unfortunately end our discussion because we are at the end of time. But we do want to thank, first of all, Lawrence, Elder
Thank you.
Harris, and Stephen for joining us. Thank you all so much.
Thank
If you
you for
haven't
having
read
me.
the book yet, you have got to read this book because it is incredible.
It
And
is
again, as we
phenomenal.
promised, we're going to do this again in person in the fall, where we can have a discussion with folks that might not be able to be here via technology. Thank you all. And
Mindy,
we'll be
one
happy
thing.
to.
One thing before you go, let folks know that since we got bombed, that they can send their questions in and so that we can respond to them, you know.
We have everybody that
Yeah,
if you
and
signed
thank
in,
you
we
for-
have your emails and we'll send out information
Yes.
to you all.
Thank you all for rising above that and the tech people for getting rid of it. And I'm sorry you guys had to see that.
Love you all, and thank you, the technicians who support us. Did a wonderful job. You got
Love
me
you all.
in.
Appreciate you.
Thank
Be well,
you.
everyone.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.